The consensus narrative is fixated on the wrong vector. Media outlets track carrier groups and missile batteries, framing the risk of peer-competitor conflict as a kinetic event. This is a fundamental misreading of the strategic landscape. As a Chinese envoy warns of the U.S. pushing toward war in the Taiwan Strait, the public is conditioned to watch the skies for incoming fire. This is a legacy warfare paradigm. It is obsolete. The primary domain of modern warfare is not kinetic. It is systemic. The initial strike will not be an explosion. It will be absolute silence. Strategic analysts at Subsea and CSES identify the true center of gravity, the global network of subsea fiber optic cables. These are the physical conduits of global finance, logistics, and military command. They represent a single point of failure with catastrophic liability. The West wrote this playbook. The doctrine of low-cost asymmetric attack was field-tested on weak states. Reports confirmed the U.S. deployed cyber attacks to disable the Venezuelan power grid, demonstrating a capacity for systemic disruption. This was perceived as a low-risk, high-leverage tool. It was a fatal miscalculation. The assumption was that the target would lack the capacity for a symmetrical response. When this doctrine is applied to a peer competitor, their only rational protocol is to escalate asymmetrically to a domain of their own maximum leverage. They will not meet a carrier with a carrier. They will sever the cables. They will blind the satellites. The objective is to engineer a blind Leviathan, a global superpower with overwhelming kinetic force, but with its nervous system severed. It cannot see, it cannot communicate, it cannot transact. It is a body without a brain. The solvency crisis is instantaneous. The war is over before launch on warning becomes relevant. This isn't a possibility. It is the endgame of the current strategic doctrine. The official narrative frames the conflict as an act of aggression. This is a fundamental misreading of the data. The kinetic event was not a strategic choice. It was the final output of a solvency crisis. When a state's internal liabilities exceed its capacity to govern, it faces a mathematical imperative. It must either collapse or externalize the crisis. CSES analysis confirms the core liability. The war was deeply unpopular domestically and served as a severe economic drain. This created a zero-sum political environment. The regime's survival became inversely proportional to the state's economic stability. This is the definition of a solvency trap. Continued peace meant systemic collapse from within. This internal weakness was compounded by an external asymmetric attack vector perfected on weaker states. The blueprint was field-tested in Venezuela. According to Politico, the Trump administration leveraged cyber attacks to disable critical infrastructure, including the power grid. This is low-cost, deniable, systemic destabilization. Faced with this dual-front crisis, internal insolvency and external asymmetric attack, a peer competitor cannot respond symmetrically. It lacks the economic liquidity and political capital. The state's only rational protocol is to pivot to a domain of maximum leverage where it can force a symmetric, kinetic response from its adversary. The escalation is not an act of strength. It is a forced, asymmetric pivot born from profound weakness. The math of modern warfare has inverted. The Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, models this inversion with brutal clarity. A main battle tank represents a $5 million kinetic asset. The first-person view drone that targets it costs $500. This isn't a simple cost-benefit analysis. It is a solvency crisis played out on the battlefield. For every one of your high-value platforms, the adversary can field 10,000 liabilities. It is a mathematical certainty of attrition. This is the democratization of violence, the systemic diffusion of high lethality technology to non-state actors and lower-tier powers. The barrier to entry for projecting kinetic force has collapsed. When a peer competitor faces low-cost systemic attacks, they recognize this same math. A symmetrical response is economic suicide. Their only rational protocol is to escalate asymmetrically to a domain of maximum leverage, transforming a low-cost strategy into a tripwire for kinetic conflict. The systemic instability you are witnessing is not a random series of national crises. It is a blueprint. These events are deliberately staged in what intelligence circles refer to as gray zones or proxy laboratories. Reports from Subsea confirm these are zero-cost proving grounds for a new doctrine of warfare. Consider the Venezuela precedent. When the power grid was systematically dismantled, it was not a conventional act of war. As later suggested by U.S. officials, it was a test of cyber attack vectors, a low-risk, low-cost field exercise in non-kinetic decapitation, perfected on a state with no capacity for symmetric retaliation. This protocol generates secondary effects, which are then studied. The subsequent do not travel warnings and breakdowns in transportation infrastructure are not bugs in the system. They are features. CSIS analysts identify these symptoms as markers of a successful systems-level stress test, creating a controlled environment to measure societal and economic collapse. The perfected playbook is then aimed at a peer competitor. The Chinese envoy's accusation of the U.S. pushing toward war is a direct acknowledgement of this protocol in action. The target recognizes the systemic attack vector, understands they cannot win a war of attrition via cyber or economic means, and their launch-on-warning protocol shifts. Their only rational move is asymmetric escalation to a domain of maximum kinetic leverage. The lab test becomes a tripwire for nonlinear global conflict. The core liability of nuclear-armed states is the use-it-or-lose-it paradox. According to analysts at CSIS, this is codified in the launch-on-warning doctrine. This is not a policy of aggression, it is a protocol of survival. The doctrine dictates that if a nation's early warning systems detect an incoming, large-scale missile attack, it must launch its own arsenal before the incoming warheads arrive and destroy its retaliatory capability. The window for this decision is not hours, it is minutes. This protocol, however, was designed for a world of radar and satellites. It has a fatal vulnerability in the digital age. The playbook of asymmetric cyber warfare, used to trigger power outages in states like Venezuela, represents a systemic accelerant when applied to a peer competitor. The new domain of conflict is not just physical space, but the information space that governs it. This creates the fog of digital war. If a cyber attack blinds a nation's early warning radar and satellite feeds, the commander in the bunker faces a mathematical certainty of existential risk. Is the data loss a technical glitch, or is it the deliberate blinding that precedes a decapitation strike? Under launch-on-warning protocol, waiting to find out is not a rational option. The absence of data becomes the signal. The fear of being disarmed forces the commander to launch based on what they can't see. The low-cost cyber probe becomes the tripwire for an irreversible kinetic exchange. The West's doctrine of low-cost asymmetric warfare was perfected in Venezuela. It was not a theory. It was a field test. As reported by Politico, the U.S. demonstrated the capability to use cyber attacks to trigger electrical grid failure on a national scale. This established a blueprint. Achieve strategic objectives through systemic destabilization, bypassing the kinetic cost of conventional conflict. This playbook is now being applied to a peer competitor. According to official diplomatic channels, a Chinese envoy has accused the U.S. of pushing toward war in the Taiwan Strait. This is the critical variable change. The target is no longer a weak, isolated state. It is a systemic power with its own domains of leverage. The competitor's response protocol is not symmetrical. They cannot win a head-on economic war against the U.S.-controlled financial system. Therefore, their only rational counter is asymmetric escalation to a domain of maximum American liability and minimum attribution. CSIS modeling shows the most effective vector is not military, but logistical. The goal: inflict a solvency crisis by paralyzing commerce. The calibration forecast. Within the next 12 months, expect a top 5 U.S. port to experience a catastrophic multi-day shutdown of its core logistics and container management software. The event will create transportation chaos mirroring travel warnings already in effect. It will be publicly attributed to a non-state ransomware group or a catastrophic server failure. This will be incorrect. It is the receipt for the Venezuela doctrine, an attribution impossible calibration shot demonstrating that the low-risk playbook is now a tripwire.